Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is my bin of mixed worms. It's a 212-day-old worm composting system. And the last time we checked in here 12 days ago, the system had just celebrated its 200th day in service, at which time we gave it its 17th feeding. And today, after 12 days, I'm assuming it's ready for its 18th feeding. What I've got in store for them is a number of cabbage leaves and some coffee. And it's a pretty substantial feeding. It's usually the amount of food that I would put into two systems, two heavily populated systems. So I was kind of questioning what I was thinking there when I just lifted up that thing, just based on its weight. Now, I got a really good suggestion when I posted the last video here where we continued to see how the system was pretty heavily populated with springtails, these little tiny white insects, which aren't really causing any sort of a problem. But somebody said, why not use Diatomaceous Earth, which I have some. And something I've not yet tried was placing it into an applicator container like this, like an old spice shaker. And I know that the Diatomaceous Earth only works when it's kept dry, because as soon as the stuff dampens, it clumps to itself, and then it no longer has that minuscule particle size, which is important to it working. So my thinking was maybe right off the bat, as soon as we reveal all the little white specks that you see there, which are the springtails, I thought maybe we can come in here with the shaker and possibly apply it directly to some of the springtails. So I'm not sure how this is going to work. I figured maybe in that instant when it's still dry, and if it goes directly onto a springtail, perhaps at that moment there's that opportunity to, actually do away with the springtail, because I guess the way the stuff works, it's not really poisonous. It's a completely organic substance, and it works by actually getting in between the body parts of an insect, and it does them in that way. So I know that as soon as we start upturning some of this material and revealing more of it that's down low beneath the surface, we're going to start seeing more and more springtails. And I thought that maybe we could even apply some more. And I know that that's really probably an uphill battle if you were to try to really address the issue that way. So I'm not expecting much here. I just thought, what the heck, let's give it a try. And you might have noticed the plastic covering was only over the feeding area, which was this side of the bin, and the other side of the bin was covered only with the paper, leaving things to dry out quite a bit over on this side. And over on that side, we've already got, for the most part, just finished castings. Let me just get rid of the plastic out of our way so we can see. These worms started out as sort of a recovery batch of worms, a very, very small population following what started to look like a crash and burn situation. So I was trying to nurse this population back to health with a very, very small starting population that began in a much smaller container. So the contents of that smaller container, when it started to seem like we'd already reestablished the worm population to a pretty decent number, that smaller bin's container contents were just dumped into here and shoved to this edge of the bin. And at that point, the material was already in a pretty finished state, so we didn't want to litter it with the material with which we were going to create a nice new additional environment for the worms to expand into. So by that nature, we ended up with this configuration where the very finished material is over on this edge of the bin that I'm examining now. And that's why when you look through here, you see almost nothing but finished castings. Here and there I've managed to contaminate it slightly with a little bit of bedding material getting mixed in here and there when I was not paying attention. But for the most part, what we've got on this edge is finished castings. And some worms enjoying it, hanging out in it quite happily, even though for some time now none of this material has been getting fed or anything. It's just been getting nudged to the side. Some people will run a system like this and consider it to be as a continuous setup, where at some point when you start running low on space and when it looks like the material on this side's getting to that point where it could just get pulled out because it's pretty much finished, you come in here and you harvest. And then you nudge things over again after you've made yourself some space. Here's a cocoon. The worms dropped into the finished castings. So yeah, that's the whole idea of like a continuous flow system that's horizontally arranged. Most people think of a continuous flow such that the material just gets pushed down through gravity, the finished stuff, and then you just keep piling the new stuff on top. But you know, in essence, you could run a continuous setup like this as well, horizontally, just moving the stuff from one edge of the bin to the other. I know some people also have adopted the concept of it being a wedge. I mean, the whole idea of the wedge, I guess, being that, you know, the wedge kind of goes from being very small on one side to being very large on the other side. And that just represents, you know, a large amount of castings here, small amount of castings over there where you've just started. Here's another cocoon. This one's so much darker than the other one we saw a moment ago, which means it's much further along in terms of nearing the point in time when the little wormies are going to come out of it. And here's another one. It's kind of interesting. I guess when the material starts to get to this very finished stage, it gets very dark in color. It's so easy to spot the cocoons. When you're looking through stuff like this, it's like camouflage, so it's a little bit tougher to spot the cocoons. So yeah, I just figured we'd examine the finished castings a little bit. I don't really run any of my systems in this continuous fashion. I always just kind of run my systems to completion, treat the whole system as done, and then haul out the worms and harvest all the castings. Although here, it might make sense at some point to come in here and just scoop out the finished material from this edge to make a little bit more space in here to work, because I'm definitely cramped for space in here. This is like the stem of a tomato. The stem is still there, and even some of that flower structure. That's pretty neat. So, alright, let's just another cocoon over here. Alright, so yeah, let's just continue with this whole concept of sort of nudging things over, even though I'm right at the very rim of the container anymore over here. Just feels like I'm running out of space. This is like a stick, which I really prefer to just remove when I bump into one. Whenever I use leaves that I've collected in the autumn, the leaf vacuum and blower that I have sort of collects things other than leaves too, you know, brings up branches, and what I end up with sometimes is, you know, a number of pretty good sized branches that get sucked up with the leaves into the collection bag. So when I find that I've placed some of that sort of stuff into my worm bins, I'll tend to fish it out. Now, this middle portion of the bin would probably be some of the material that the worms have been working on since they've been living in this somewhat larger container. And it's been a while now, a good couple months since we moved them from the little tiny container we started them out in over into this somewhat larger container, although I still consider this to just be medium-sized when it comes to the different types of containers I run my worm bins in. So I've gone from running these worms in a small container with what started as just a few dozen worms, giving them time to sort of get back on their feet and start expanding their numbers, and then when it seemed like we had a decent sized population coming together in that small container. It seemed like it was fitting to relocate them into slightly larger quarters. And now I'm almost wondering if it might be time again to consider giving them a somewhat larger home. I guess the other option just being that, maybe we start trying to drive this system towards harvest. Or me actually following through with the entire concept of how this system is running right now anyway. The whole opportunity that exists right here to actually start pulling out completed castings from one edge of the bin to make room for ongoing composting on the opposite edge. So I'm definitely questioning whether it paid off or not to leave this edge of the bin uncovered, or at least it was covered with paper but not covered with plastic, which allowed a lot of drying to occur here. I'm almost wondering now, I'm seeing a good number of springtails down in this material too, so what the heck, let's just see what we could do. Maybe we'll end up knocking a few of them out in the process and reducing their numbers slightly. I guess the drying was also intended to have that same effect, possibly reducing the number of mites living in this system. Not mites, I'm sorry, springtails. But like I said earlier, I don't think that they're causing a problem. They're not really disturbing anyone. And like I've said in previous videos too, as long as they stay put in this container, they don't bother me too much. If I were to start seeing outbreaks of springtails in all my systems, then I would really be taken aback, and then I would feel like I missed the opportunity to knock them out here. So I do sometimes worry that maybe I should keep this system in somewhat better isolation so that I don't find myself needing to deal with springtails in all my systems. Oddly enough, this is the only place I really observe them, and here too you can see quite a number of them. Sometimes it's fun to just let the camera run like that so you can get a better visualization of what's happening with these slow-moving creatures, like with the worms or with the springtails. And the springtails don't seem to react quite as drastically as the worms. The worms definitely scurry out of view quite quickly as soon as they're out in the bright lights. Springtails seem to do the same thing. They'll eventually try to get out of the broad daylight too and retreat down into the material, but I think that right there gave us a little opportunity to check them out. So here I am just trying to follow through with this idea that one of my viewers gave me to see if maybe we'd be able to tackle some of the springtail population in here with the diatomaceous earth that I'm sprinkling in. But I think we've already spent a good 10 minutes rummaging around here, just exploring, as I've been, in case you haven't noticed, gradually nudging things across here, trying to continue with this whole concept of the wedge pattern, or the the continuous flow configuration of this system. Taking a little pause here and there just to see what's happening and to apply a little bit of this DE, diatomaceous earth. But I think we're close enough to the feeding end now that we should probably just press on with the main objective of getting today's feeding in here and checking out how they did with the last feeding. I remember we were pretty generous on the bedding last time we came in here to feed, and I'm not sure we're going to need to add too much more bedding, but I'm thinking we probably will. As you can see, we've already started bumping into some of the leftover bedding from last time. I think the stuff we fed them last time was potato, mainly potato peels, with a little bit of potato still left on the peels. but it was all frozen, which probably made the potato nice and mushy as it thawed out. And what the worms have done was pretty much stripped all that potato peel clean of all the potato, all the starchy goodness, leaving behind just the skins. A little bit of potato skin remaining here and there, but not a whole lot of it. I mean, for every piece there was in here, there is just the skin remaining basically. So here too, I'm just feeling compelled to sort of upturn what's going on here just to see if we can reveal perhaps one more round of springtails to be treated with this stuff, and then we can proceed, I believe, to feeding them. I've got a few pieces of newspaper laying around here. I had just carved up a pumpkin so that I could chop it up into little bits and freeze it all so that I could use it as worm food going forward. And then I also put the seeds that I fished out of it on a piece of paper to dry. And then since the oven was running yesterday, I went ahead and dried them. So I've been maintaining a pretty good collection of pumpkin seeds that I eventually grind up along with some other ingredients to create my worm chow. So I've got that sitting here on standby to use as some of our food to feed with today. So now I thought that maybe I could reuse the piece of newspaper on which the seeds had been placed temporarily to dry a little bit ahead of being placed into the oven to dry them out completely in the end. So I've got this piece of paper here. It's a little bit wrinkled up because it was quite damp, and I thought that maybe we could just use that as the bedding for today's feeding. And since I've got coffee to give them, that means we've also got coffee filters, which means that the coffee filter that we encountered on the way in, this one here, I'm thinking maybe we could use this as supplemental bedding as well. But only after we give the springtails that have made themselves at home on this thing a little treatment of this Diatomaceous Earth, which hopefully is dry enough to do its job. So now, why don't we proceed with the setup of their feeding area, which I've made quite substantial in size by nudging everything over to the other side of the bin, bringing the whole level of this thing almost right to the top rim. So it does feel to me like at some point soon we're going to be needing to do something in here, because we're just going to be out of room, and we're not going to be able to continue adding stuff to this thing. So you might have noticed how nice and straight these tears all happened. I even remember in an arts and crafts session in grammar school or maybe junior high school how the teacher explained how the grain of the newspaper is usually the long way, is your friend when it comes to tearing newspaper into nice even strips. And if you try to tear it across the grain of the paper, then you're not going to be able to come up with nice straight, breaks. So I thought that was kind of cool how you can take a piece of newspaper and almost tear it perfectly into strips, as long as you're doing so across the grain. And you know what? I've got a little bit of leafy material we could include here too. So I think what we'll do is we'll try to combine the leaves and the paper together so we don't end up with stuff that's just matting together. And here too is another example of a stick that my leaf collection process caught along the way. But if I can exclude it right from the start, I'll do so. So that looks like a pretty nice setup right there, into which all this paper can get dropped in. And the materials that we're putting in here today, those cabbage leaves, although they're frozen and they're going to emit some moisture as they thaw, they're not going to emit much. And then the coffee too. I mean, the coffee, one of the coffees is from yesterday, and the other coffee came out of the machine just moments ago. But none of it really brings with it a great deal of moisture either. So my thought was to just cover up this entire bin again with plastic, end to end, not attempting to prompt any further drying like we did last time. And perhaps go the route of trying to provide them with a feeding that's just a little bit drier in nature than what they often get, which like last time included, you know, potato peels, which weren't very damp, but there were also chunks of pumpkin, which probably did drop a good bit of moisture into the feeding zone. This stuff that they're getting here today, I don't think it's going to add a whole lot of moisture to the situation here. And you know, it does feel like it would be good to try to bring the level of this up to match the rest of the system. So even though the food that we're adding seems possibly more than we usually do, I think we're just going to follow suit with that, as long as we're being uber generous anyway. And we're just going to go big on the bedding too. Why not? Then I think what we're really doing is just robbing ourselves the opportunity in the near future to continue expanding on the space in here, and then maybe it'll just be down to applying feedings into here anymore, rather than trying to expand the volume of the material that the worms have to live in. That has actually sort of been my theme in a lot of my systems, is to try to bring the container up closer to its capacity sooner rather than later, all the while giving the worms space to roam around in and to live in, and not treat that as just like a gradual thing to drive towards in terms of increase in the material in the system. Just treat that as like a good starting you know, a starting setup criteria. So this is totally in line with what I've been trying to do anyway in most of my systems. And you know, look at all this coffee we still need to add to this thing. Holy cow. Super generous feeding. So I am starting to think that maybe another thing we could do is grab a little bit of my prepared bedding that went through my shredder that recently expired and has been thrown away. So I've got a pretty good little reserve of shredded cardboard and paper, perhaps 10 gallons or more. So it's what's in 2 5-gallon buckets full, plus what I've got in my my little supply of prepared bedding. So I thought maybe we would grab my prepared bedding and use that as sort of the topper here. But what I'm doing here now is adding my worm chow to the coffee, because it does seem to me like just putting the coffee in on its own is just I don't know, it's just going to cause the stuff to sit there without a whole lot of interest in it. But if I add the worm chow, it always seems like the worms really take a shine to it and just eat it all right up. So hopefully that's what ends up happening here again today. And the stuff that I'm referring to is starting to run a little bit low, so I'll probably have to tap into my reserve in those 2 5-gallon buckets to replenish. But this stuff always gets put away damp. You can even see some of the moisture sitting at the bottom of the container over there. So this stuff is also coming in damp, so somewhat damp coffee. The dampness that'll come off those cabbage leaves, you know, hopefully that'll all help offset the dry newspaper and the dry leaves that we sprinkled in here earlier. And something tells me that this feeding zone is going to collapse considerably. by the next time we come back in here to check on these worms, because the the worms will start breaking it all down and it'll all settle just from the worm traffic being there as well. So I have a feeling this will not be quite at the same level as the rest of the material in the system next time we come back in here. And with all this food that we just gave them, I'm even wondering if maybe we can extend the interval between the next check-in to perhaps even more than the 12 days we waited since the last feeding. With what we just gave them, the system should be good for quite some time. Alright, well, I didn't think I was going to spend that much time in here. Look at that. Jeez, almost a half hour. Sorry about that. I do have a tendency to go on and on sometimes. But I did want to try the Diatomaceous Earth. I did want to see about, possibly nudging things over in the direction of the finished end of the bin to make more space in here. And it was just interesting in general to explore what was going on here, so I don't mind taking a little bit longer to feed a single bin than usual. It's usually because I'm having a good time and I can't help myself anyway. So there goes the plastic back on, covering the entire system again, which will allow the entire system to remain nice and damp for worm traffic everywhere. And that nice spacious feeding zone, I think, will probably attract a crowd too. So we're done here. I've got a few things I've got to take care of getting cleaned up and put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That stuff's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.